Do you want to learn how you can make your own API, which allows you to translate text between languages? In this video, that is exactly what I'm going to teach you how to do. Hi guys, my name is Sam with Complete Coding, where our aim is to make you into the best developer that you can be. In this video, we're going to be looking at how we can create our own translation API using serverless and TypeScript. This is a really cool project, as being able to dynamically translate languages is a really cool tool that can be used inside your applications. Make sure you listen to the end of this video, because at the end I'm going to be giving you a link to download the source code for this project. So now let's jump into the app and see how we can build this. Now that we're back in the code, we're going to create our second endpoint. As we've done when we created our first endpoint, we're going to create a new function in our lambdas folder and create a new file and call that translate.ts. What I'm going to do is actually copy the original get city info and paste that in before deleting our city information and the code inside our handler. Before we actually get started with this handler, we're going to do one other thing. This API responses code is going to be used in every single one of our endpoints, so having to recopy and paste it every time seems a bit silly. What we're going to do is move this to a common file so that we can pull that in and use it wherever we want. So inside lambdas, I'm going to create a new folder, and that folder is going to be called common. And in here, I'm going to create a new file, call that API responses.ts. In our translate, I can then copy this API responses and cut that out of there and paste it into here. If we now export that at the top of this file, we are going to have this exported, and for good measure we're going to export default API responses so that it can also be exported and imported as the default value. If we now go back into our translate, we can start building our handler, knowing that we can use these API responses from our common file. What we're going to be doing in this video is allowing users to hit us, or hit this API at least, with a body which has a text and a language on it. We will use Amazon's translate and then return back the translation. So to start that, we first need to get that body. So const body equals event.body. But when AWS passes the body to us, it has actually stringified it. And we know this is JSON, so what we can do is json.parse event.body. And what this is going to do is mean that we now have a body which is JSON. We can now get the text and the language off the body by saying const object with text and language equals body. So now we have both the text and the language elements, and we want to check that both of those have been passed up. So if there is not text, we want to return API responses, and when I do this, it's acting to auto import it from our common folder. So now we've added that import to the top of our file, we can do ._400 with a message of missing text from the body, and that will just work. We can do the same test for the language. So if there is not a language, return API responses ._400, and that is going to have a message, and that message is going to be missing language from the body. We could do a lot more checking on this. For example, checking that text is a string, checking that language is a string, checking that language is a string which equals one of the translatable languages in AWS. But for now, this will do. The next thing we need to do is actually translate this using AWS Translate. This is using one of the services, which is an asynchronous service. So using async await, we're going to wrap this in a try catch. So now we have this try catch. Inside here, what we're going to do is we're going to actually access our translation. To translate something, we need to create some parameters. So we can say that const translate params equals an object. But for now, we don't know what kind of object this is. So we're going to move on to the next step. The next step is saying that const translated message equals await translate dot, and then this translate is actually going to be something from the AWS SDK. So what we need to do is scroll up to the top of our file and import star as AWS from AWS SDK. And now this has been highlighted as red because we haven't actually installed this yet. So if we go into our terminal and run npm install --dev, now this can be installed as a dev dependency because by default every Lambda has the AWS SDK already installed on it, so we don't need to pass that up as an extra node module. So once this has finished installing, we can start creating our translation. So we're going to create the new version of this translate service. So const translate equals new AWS dot translate and call that constructor. And now we have our own version of the translation service. So now here where we've got translate, we can do dot, and then we have all of the methods available on here. The one we're looking for is translate text, and then this function needs to be passed the translate parameters. So this is now complaining that the translate text function parameters aren't what it expects. So one way to find out what it does expect is to press Control and click on your function, and this will bring you through to your AWS type definition. In here, we can see that it takes a parameter of translate types translate text request. So what we can do is copy this translate text request and copy this whole type, go back into our function and declare this translate parameters to have this type. This is obviously highlighted in red because we haven't imported this type definition. So if we click on quick fixes we can import the translate type from module from the AWS SDK, which has done that there. And now this is complaining that our empty object is missing text, source language, and target language. So we can actually copy these three parameters, paste them into our object, and these are the keys for our object. So the first one being text, we're going to assign our text that has been passed up by the customer. The source language code is the language that we are sending it from, or translating it from, should I say. And for this, I'm going to go with EN, as that is English. If you wanted, you could have a third parameter on the body, which is a source language. For example, you could set it translating from Spanish to German. But for now, we're just going to go with this. Finally, we need a target language, and that is going to be the language that was passed up in the body. And these mean that we have a completed translation parameters. So now that we're calling this translate text, we just need to add a .promise onto the end. And this .promise turns the translate text from a callback into a promise. And this is something that a lot of the AWS services are able to do, but just check in the documentation if you're using a different service. Now that we have the translated message, we need to return that to a customer. We can do that by doing return API responses ._200 and passing back an object with the parameter of translated message. So this will return back that object, but what happens if there's an error in this? There could be an error for a multitude of reasons. You could not have the correct permissions, you could have not used a language that AWS is able to translate from, or there could have been some other sort of error. So in this catch, we want to first console log out the error. So there was an error in the translation. As well as that, we also want to return a 400 to the customer. So return API responses ._400, passing a message of unable to translate the message. So if we now save this file, we've completed all of the logic in here that we need to do to be able to create this translation. Now that we've done that, we can go back into our serverless.ts file, and there are two things we need to do. The first is add a new function with a new endpoint, which is exactly what we've done in a previous video. The second is actually to add the permissions to our provider, which allow us to use the AWS Translate service. By default, the Lambdas have the minimum amount of permissions possible, so every new service you want to add, you need to add to this provider. You could also add them to individual functions if you want, but we're going to be going with the default provider version for now. So inside our functions, we need to add a new function, and that one is going to be called translate. Inside here, it needs to have a handler, and that handler is going to be lambdas /translate dot handler, because it's the translate function inside our lambdas folder, and the function is called handler. As well as that, we need to have our events, which is an array of objects. It's going to be a HTTP object. And in this, we have a path. and our path is going to be translate, pretty simple. Here we have a bit of a difference because our method is going to be a post, but the last thing, which is cause, is still going to be true, so that we can make this request from a different URL path. So we could use this, for example, if we built a front-end application. Now that we have that, we need to scroll back up to our provider and add a new parameter to here. And that parameter is IAMROLE-statements. And this is going to be an array. And in this array, we have a couple of different parameters. The first one is an effect. Inside these statements, we have objects with a couple of parameters. The first is an effect, and that effect is either allow or deny. So you can explicitly allow your Lambda to do things, or you can explicitly deny it from doing things. For now, we're going to go with allow. And then we have the action, which is an array of strings which define what we're allowing this Lambda to do. In our case, it is translate : star, which allows it to use the translate service. The last thing is resource, and this resource is going to be star, which allows us to use the translate service on any resource. If you're using something like S3 and you're doing S3 get, this is where the resource section becomes more applicable, because you don't want to give your Lambda access to read every single S3 bucket. You want to give it access to read specific S3 buckets. Now that we have that, if we save this file, we've done everything we need to create this API. So if we go into our terminal again and run SLS deploy one more time, this is going to deploy all of this code with our new API endpoint for translation and update its permissions so it is allowed to access the translate AWS SDK. This takes a little bit of time to do, so I'll get back to you when that is done. So now that has finished deploying, if we make our terminal a little bit bigger, we can see that we have both a get from the last video as well as a new post endpoint. I'm going to copy this new post endpoint and we're going to head over to a browser where we can test this out. So unlike the last video where we're able to go to a URL to test it, because this is a post request, we need to do something slightly different. If you want, you could use any of your own abilities to test APIs, such as using curl or postman, but I'm going to use a new service called postwoman.io, and this is a online version of Postman, but actually has a couple of new things that are really, really cool. For now, what we can do is we can paste in our new endpoint, which is like this. So it's /dev/translate. If we go down to here, we need to make sure that raw input is turned on. And in our body, we can add a text and a destination language. There's a list of AWS Translate languages, which I'll link in the description below. But for now, I'm going to go with FR, but you could try DE or SE or ES, and I think those are some that do already work. If we now hit send, this is going to make that request to our system, and we get a 200 response. And in the bottom, we see that we get a translated message object with the translated text. And I'm not going to try and butcher the pronunciation of this, but that is what it has been translated to in French. This means that our translation has worked, and you could use this inside any of your systems where you need to add translation to your apps. In this video, we have looked at how we can build our own API using AWS, Serverless and TypeScript. We've worked with the AWS SDK to access the Translate APIs and the Translate service. We then built our own API endpoint, which allows us to receive a POST request, which contains a language and some text to translate. Once we've translated that, we return that back to the user. We also had to add that new endpoint to our serverless TypeScript file and add some permissions so that we were able to access and use that AWS service. If you've learned something new in this video, make sure to give it a like, and as promised, the link for the code is in the description below. So check that out if you want to see how you can implement this into your own applications. If you haven't done already, make sure to subscribe down here, as I release videos every single week on serverless development to help you become a better developer. Thank you, and I'll see you in next week's video.